Today, I'm going over 10 signs of childhood emotional neglect, and I will be sharing ways to manage or start healing from these signs. I'm a licensed therapist, and I see emotional neglect come up so frequently in therapy, but many people have no idea they experienced it. That's because emotional neglect is subtle. It's not always about what happened, it's often about the comfort, validation, and connection that never did. Before we jump into the signs, let's define what emotional neglect actually is. This is different from physical neglect. Physical neglect is when someone doesn't get the food, clothing, shelter, or medical care they need. Emotional neglect is when a child's emotional needs, like being comforted when they're sad, being seen when they're struggling, being supported when they're scared, aren't met. Not once or twice, but over and over and over again. Everyone has moments when their parents or caregivers miss something. That's not emotional neglect. Emotional neglect is when these emotional needs are dismissed so consistently that the child learns deep down that their feelings don't matter. Okay, so let's dive into the signs. The first sign of emotional neglect is you struggle to identify and name your emotions. This is probably one of the most common signs I see. If someone asks how you're feeling and your answer is always fine, okay, or I don't know, that's not just a personality quirk, that's a learned response. A lot of people who experienced emotional neglect weren't taught how to slow down and actually check in with themselves. Instead, they learned to push through, to stay in their head, to ignore the body, the heart, and any emotional cues. And when you're not asked, how are you feeling in a meaningful way? Or worse, when your emotions are brushed off, you eventually stop asking yourself that question too. This can create a kind of emotional flatness. It doesn't mean you don't have feelings. It means you never had the space to develop the language and trust needed to express them. You might even find it difficult to comfort others because reflecting on feelings just feels awkward or unfamiliar. To start improving this, build an emotional vocabulary. That means naming the nuance, not just angry, but frustrated, disrespected, overwhelmed. The more words you have, the more you reconnect with the parts of yourself that were ignored for too long. The second sign of emotional neglect is you downplay your own needs. If your feelings were met with annoyance or shame, or if your sadness made others uncomfortable, you may have learned that it's better to stay quiet. So now, as an adult, you hesitate to speak up. You might tell yourself it's not a big deal, even when it really is. You may say things like, I don't want to be a burden, even when you're overwhelmed. You bottle things up to avoid conflict, only to feel resentful later. It becomes automatic, and over time you stop recognizing your own internal red flags. Downplaying your needs doesn't mean you don't have them. It means you were taught that they're inconvenient. But emotional needs, being heard, being valued, being supported, are valid. They don't disappear just because we push them down. One way to begin changing this is by practicing how to express a small need. Even if it feels uncomfortable, role-playing this in therapy can help you learn to voice a need and see that the world doesn't fall apart when you do. The third sign of emotional neglect is you constantly crave achievement. Achievement itself isn't the problem, but when it becomes your only sense of worth, that's something to pause on. Many people who experienced emotional neglect were only noticed when they performed. You were seen when you got the grades, when you made someone proud, but not necessarily for just being yourself. So you learned that love was earned, not freely given, and now as an adult you chase promotions, accomplishments, praise, not because they fill you up, but because they quiet that voice inside that keeps wondering, am I good enough? You might equate worth with doing, not being, and through time that turns into constant striving. You feel like you have to prove your value in relationships and work, even in your right to rest. It's not about ambition, it's about survival. One helpful change is moving from a goals-driven life to a values-driven one. Instead of asking, what did I accomplish today? Ask, did I show up as the kind of person that I want to be? Number 4, you seek out emotionally unavailable people. When emotional neglect is all you knew growing up, that dynamic can feel oddly familiar. You may find yourself drawn to partners, friends, or mentors who don't show up for you emotionally. Not because you like being neglected, but because part of you is still hoping that this time it's gonna be different. You may make excuses for people who consistently let you down. You might even feel most drawn to those who are inconsistent, those who give you just enough to stay hopeful, but not enough to feel safe. That kind of emotional distance starts to feel like normal. But what feels familiar isn't always what's healthy, and this pattern rarely brings healing, it often brings re-traumatization. To begin changing this pattern, imagery rescripting can help. You revisit old memories, but this time you imagine your adult self stepping in with comfort and protection. Narrative therapy can also be powerful, where you rewrite your story with a different ending, where your needs are finally heard. The fifth sign of emotional neglect is you have difficulty asking for help. If asking for help led to rejection, criticism, or punishment when you were young, then of course you'd learn to avoid it. You may have been praised for being so independent, but underneath that praise might be a loneliness no one ever acknowledged. It can show up in small ways, turning down help, brushing off concerns, or keeping everything to yourself even when you're barely holding it together. You've learned that needing others equals risk, so now you keep it all in, even if it's eating you alive. This becomes exhausting. You may be overwhelmed or burnt out, but still feel like reaching out is wrong. Even when you do ask for help, you might apologize for it, as if you're being a burden just for needing support. Healing this starts with one low-stakes practice. Ask for something small that doesn't feel risky. It could be a favor from someone safe, or even a question you would usually avoid. Little by little, you'll retrain your nervous system to see asking for help as safe. Number 6, you blame yourself for things that aren't your fault. You might apologize constantly, even when nothing is your fault. If someone else makes a mistake, your first thought might be, "Did I do something wrong?" You take on emotional responsibility for things that were never yours to carry. This often starts in childhood when adults didn't take responsibility for their own emotions or actions, and because kids naturally assume their caregivers are good and safe, the blame gets turned inward. As an adult, this can look like guilt over small things, overanalyzing everything you said, or replaying interactions for hours. You're not trying to be dramatic, you're just trying to feel safe. One of the most important things to learn is that guilt isn't always a signal that you've done something wrong. Sometimes it's just your nervous system reacting to an old pattern. The healing starts when you start to learn to recognize which guilt is yours and which isn't. Number 7, you struggle to trust others. When emotional support wasn't consistent growing up, trust becomes risky, not because you're cold or distant, but because your nervous system is on high alert for emotional danger. You want to connect, you want to feel safe, but your body remembers what it felt like to be let down. You may keep one foot out the door. You may assume kindness always comes with strings. You may feel like if people really knew you, they would leave. But part of you still hopes, still longs for safety, and that's not being naive, it's human. To begin rebuilding trust, focus on noticing one positive social interaction a day. It could be as small as someone holding the door or offering a smile. When you consistently register those safe moments, you teach your brain to see connection as possible again. Number 8, you overexplain yourself. Overexplaining often looks like thoroughness, but it usually comes from fear. You may feel like you need to justify every decision, every feeling, every move, just to avoid being misunderstood or judged. This often stems from childhood environments where misunderstanding led to real consequences. Maybe you were blamed for things you didn't do. Maybe your emotions were questioned or dismissed. So now, you give too much context. "I'm sorry I'm late. There was traffic. I left early. I didn't want you to think I was careless." When a simple, "Thanks for waiting" would have been enough. The healing here is learning to say less, to answer briefly, and to sit with the discomfort that comes when you're not perfectly understood. You'll survive it, and over time, it feels less threatening. Number 9, you people please out of fear. Kindness becomes people-pleasing when it's driven by fear instead of choice. That fear often started in childhood, when your safety or belonging depended on keeping others happy. So now you say yes when you mean no. You anticipate everyone's needs. You keep the peace even at your own expense. You're not doing this for approval. You're doing it because it feels like the only way to stay safe. But relationships built on self-abandonment don't bring true connection. They bring resentment and exhaustion. To start changing this, you don't need to overhaul your personality. Just practice pausing. When someone asks something of you, pause and ask yourself, do I actually want to do this? That one pause creates space for choice, and it's a great first step toward authenticity. Number 10, you struggle to set and maintain boundaries. If your boundaries were ignored or punished in childhood, you may have learned that saying no means losing love, that asserting yourself means conflict. So now, boundaries feel selfish, even dangerous. You keep tolerating things that hurt. You stay quiet to avoid rocking the boat, but deep down, resentment builds. Boundaries aren't about pushing people away. They're about protecting your peace. They say, this is what I need to feel safe, connected, and whole. And yes, they might bring guilt at first, but that guilt often means you're finally honoring yourself. You can start small. One boundary, one situation, one moment where you say, I need this. If you continue treating me like this is what I'm gonna do. That is how you start setting boundaries. If you saw yourself in any of these signs, just know this wasn't your fault. These patterns started as survival strategies, but survival mode is not meant to be permanent. Each small step you take now is a way of respecting yourself in a way no one else did back then. And that's where healing begins. That's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you, and see you in the next one.